These are the lectionary texts from the Common Lectionary that will be used in many churches on November the 19th, the Sunday right before Thanksgiving. For those of you that are following through the YouTube channel, I'm not very good at doing things on YouTube, and I accidentally punched in November 22nd for last Sunday as opposed to November 12th, and I did hear from a few folks that was confusing. I don't know how to go back in and change that date so that it says November 12th instead of November 22nd. So I will make it a point to look very carefully this time before I upload it to make sure that it does say that this is for November the 19th. Toward the end of the Christian year, a reminder here, Advent begins the Christian year, and that begins with the 4 Sundays before Christmas. The texts tend to look towards the end of times. Now, the 2 Old Testament texts won't do that, but the 2 New Testament texts are going to suggest something about that. But it can't help but be in our minds to see how these tend to work. And in an interesting way, you could say that the text from Judges indicates a sort of repetitive end of times, or a repetitive end of peace. And we tend to think that when peace is disturbed in a way that seems very threatening, that, maybe this is when everything's going to end. So I think what we have in Judges is that kind of a notion. Our first text is Judges, the 4th chapter, and it only gives us the first 7 verses, which is very disappointing to me. And were I to be preaching on it on the 19th, and I'm not preaching on it, I would preach on that entire section through the battle, and we're going to talk about it here in just a moment. But first, in looking at the book of Judges, I'd suggest that you glance through the first 3 chapters, and you don't have to spend a lot of time dwelling, but you're going to pick up on a rhythm during the time of Judges, which is the people are obedient for a little while, they fall away from worshiping the one true God, there are threats to their territory, there are wars, they return to God, then it happens all over again. They fall away and worship false gods. There are threats. There's a war. They return to God. This vicious cycle over and over and over. Now, that may seem unusual to us, but think about this. When World War II broke out, people returned to church. When 9/11 happened, people returned to church. Is it because they're looking for answers? Maybe. Is it because they are renewing some level of faith that they once had or hoped to have? Maybe. But it just seems to be that that is a habit of human beings in time of great threat to life. There is a response that has something to do with turning to the Almighty for answers or for comfort or for hope or something. So what we see in the book of Judges is very human in how that happens. This sense of calamity, response in seeking wisdom from the divine, a time of peace, and then calamity again. The other thing that frames all of the material in the book of Judges, that's the beginning of the frame. The end of it is right at the very end of the book. Let's see if I can put my finger on it here real quickly. Yeah, the very last verse in Judges 21, Judges 21 verse 25. In those days there was no king in Israel. All the people did what was right in their own eyes. That's going to frame the rhythms in between, but it also does something that we should be very mindful of, and that is anyone who writes histories is writing through an interpretive lens. And so we can see multiple histories written about American history or world history, and there's always an interpretive lens. This particular interpretive lens is part of the Deuteronomistic view of history, which wants to advocate for a king. Even though when we get to the time of kings, we could almost say the same thing's happening, that certainly the kings aren't always doing what's right either. So there's the framework for the book of Judges, or we might say the framework for all humanity in all times. The text today, the first 7 verses, again, read all the way through the next section, is about Deborah and Barak, who was going to lead the army. Now here's an important thing to remember. We often think of people as treating women as second-class citizens, and in truth, almost every culture has done that, and some cultures continue to do that. Here in this time of the Judges, it is clear that when someone arises to a position of wisdom, they are trusted. It doesn't matter whether they are a man or a woman. And so here is Deborah, who has risen to be judge. That means people are appealing to her wisdom, seeking her guidance, seeking her correction. And she, in this case, is actually speaking out without being sought. And so Deborah, who is listed as a prophetess, even lists who her husband is, and we'll forget him right off the bat because I don't think he's ever mentioned anywhere ever again. But the people of Israel are under the thumb of an exterior power. And so Deborah goes to Barak and tells Barak to take 10,000 men and go up on Mount Tabor, and with the right signal to come down, because going up on Mount Tabor is going to lure this other king and his troops into the Wadi Kishon. The name of the other king is Sisera, which is important really after verse 7. But it's going to lure these troops into this wadi. Now, in a real way, something that is not mentioned in the text, or it's actually, maybe I could say it's mentioned in the text, but you and I don't pick up on that. Wherever you see that word wadi, W-A-D-I, it is to remind us of an area that gets dry and gets very wet very quickly. And so a wadi, the land beneath, gets very muddy and mucky. I expect that has something to do with having lured Sisera and those troops into this area with their chariots, that makes those chariots hard to move once that wadi gets muddy. Now, nothing in here tells us that's what happened, but that would be my suspicion because of how it says this will lure those troops into that area. At any rate, the text stops just about there, except Barak is saying that, well, actually that comes in the next verse. Read the whole thing, because Barak is going to say that I'm not going into battle unless you come with me. And so Deborah says, all right, I'll go. So Deborah is going to go into battle. She's so convinced of God's intent to free the people from under the thumb of this opposing power. So read it from there. The one thing Deborah says is, okay, I'll go with you, but because you won't go without me, credit for the win in this battle is going to go to a woman. Now, at first glance, we think that means her, but read on. It's going to have to do with someone who's not a judge, someone who is not known for wisdom, someone who may not even have known that this battle was being constructed with a design at all, but a woman on the fringes of the culture, just a woman who lives in a tent with her husband. Her husband's gone. Maybe he's one of the people in the battle. And it's going to be a woman who kills Sisera with a tent peg through the temple. But that's part of the story. So what we see here is that eradicating an enemy from the people of Israel during the time of Deborah becomes the responsibility of two women, Deborah, the prophetess, and this little woman, Jael, who finishes the battle so that it can never take place again. So even though this was a patriarchal culture, not just the patriarchs as in Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, but a man-dominated culture, we see these little bits and pieces that first came through in early Genesis, that God's intention is not for men to dominate, but for men and women to live and coordinate and work together for God's plan. Very powerful story. So read through that and don't stop at the end of verse 7, because I sure wouldn't stop there. Let me just mention one other thing in Judges. The very next section, Judges 5, called the Song of Deborah. It's beautiful poetry, and many of the best scholars consider this to be the earliest written section of the Old Testament. Now, most of the stories were carried orally for a long time, but they consider this possibly to be the earliest written section. Pretty interesting. Or maybe the earliest written one that there's any inkling of being able to trace something that old. Just throwing that in just for fun. The psalm is Psalm 123, and I got to tell you, I much prefer short psalms to long psalms, and this is a short psalm. It is, at the top of it, you'll see it's called a psalm of ascent, which often means it's a psalm of pilgrimage to people going up to the temple. The way the temple was set, there was a valley on virtually 3 of the sides. And so it was elevated up, and the way you got onto the Temple Mount was onto a road coming up. So as pilgrims would come, a psalm of ascent, you can almost imagine when they're getting close and they behold the temple rising above on the hill, on the mountain right there, that this is one of the psalms that pilgrims would speak aloud. And it's often worth considering that it's done antiphonally, as in one voice starts and other voices respond. And that's the way this one is written. To you I lift up my eyes, to you who are enthroned in, O you who are enthroned in the heavens. As the eyes of servants work to the hand of their master, as the eyes of a maid to the hand of her mistress, so, and all of a sudden it shifts from first person singular to first person plural. So our eyes look to the Lord our God, for he has had mercy on us. And the rest of it is our, and speaking to the Lord, from I to our. So it does suggest that one person would start it, and then the others would follow in. So it goes from I to our. A beautiful psalm that acknowledges both human frailty and dependence upon the Lord. And now to the New Testament, keeping in mind particularly the end of days, we get to the end of 1 Thessalonians, the 5th chapter, and it's the first 11 verses. And with regard to the ultimate end of days on earth, you know, in virtually every 30 years or so, somebody comes up with some formula determining when the end of the world is going to be. I remember these all the way back into high school. I can name names, but I feel like they have been so discredited that it's not worth naming names. The last one I remember that was truly put up billboards about it was around 2009 or 10, but I recall there may have been one since then trying to calculate when the end of days comes. But Paul says it best. Now concerning the times and the seasons, brothers and sisters, you do not need to have anything written to you, for you yourselves know very well that the day of the Lord will come like a thief in the night. When they say there is peace and security, then sudden destruction will come upon them, as labor pains come upon a pregnant woman, and there will be no escape. In other words, nobody knows. Now, Jesus said the same thing, that saying even he didn't know, only the Father. So I hope that one day we'll get to a point where this doesn't rile us up as much and make us think that somebody's actually calculated it, because it simply cannot be done. Now, the rest of what Paul is writing has to do with encouraging each other until those end of days happens to occur. And in fact, that's how he ends it. But before we get to the very end, he reminds the Christians that we belong to the light, that we are children of the day. And because we are children of the day, it means that we, in a sense, are troops for the good things that Christ calls on us to be about in the world. And so he says about the breastplate of faith and love and the helmet of hope of salvation. And then he ends it by saying, therefore, encourage one another and build up each other, as indeed you are doing. We often tend to think of our Christian faith as a very personal thing, just me and Jesus. That is such an inappropriate thought about our faith. To be sure, there are personal things about our faith. But over and over, the testimony, particularly in Paul's letters, has to do with how we rally together. And in this one, this last phrase about encouraging one another and building up each other is so key to the purpose of the Christian faith. We really cannot just worship alone on a TV screen. We really need dialogue together where we can express our hopes, cares, hurts, dreams, fears in the presence of our fellow believers, so that they, in their own way, in sharing our experience and in sharing their own with us, can provide for us hope and encouragement. That's precisely what Paul means. So here in this meantime, whether you are among people that are anxiously awaiting the end, or whether you're among those who don't think the end will ever come in our lifetime, our role as Christians is to encourage each other in the life we have been given for as long as we have been given life. And now from the Gospel of Matthew, this is the second of three parables that have to do with the end of days. This again is from Matthew, the 25th chapter. And this one begins in the, bear with me, it'll be online of course, but I can never remember which verse it begins in. It's pretty obvious though. Oh, it begins in verse 14. It's the parable of the talents. Now, oftentimes we tend to allegorize what's going on in the parable and think of talents in an inappropriate way. This word for talent, as I've said in virtually every church I've been in, is a measure of money, and it's a huge measure of money. And just for fun, look to see what a common laborer, and I'm not even sure what would amount to a common laborer in our day and time. Maybe average worker's salary. I don't know what you could think exactly. But a talent, and I've seen it listed as low as 10 years of wages equals 1 talent. I've seen it as high as 20 years of wages equaling 1 talent. The new RSV indicates 15, so let's go with 15, sort of a nice halfway between those. 1 talent equals 15 years of wages. And so our story is about a man, and again, don't allegorize this and say this is Jesus going away and coming back. I don't think that's what's intended here, although it may well be in Matthew's mind, but I don't think that's what's intended. And remember, a parable is something that could have been drawn from real life, so it's not an allegory from its beginning. Next week will be an allegory, not this one. So A very wealthy man leaves, and he calls 3 servants to him, and to one he gives 5 talents, to another 2 talents, and to another one 1 talent. And he leaves. He says, I'll be back one day. So we don't know the length of time that he's gone. But in the meantime, the fellow with 5 talents invests it. We might see an inkling of capitalism here, but he invests it, and he gets a return of 5 more. The fellow with 2 invests and gets a return of 2 more. The fellow with 1 buries it. Now, I'm disappointed that in Matthew, one little element is lacking that is in a similar story elsewhere, and that is to fold it in a napkin and bury it. And my guess is when Jesus told this parable, though, his hearers were thinking that's how he buried it, not in a paper napkin, something that's cloth. There was a prescribed way of burying something of wealth, of value, for safekeeping, and to demonstrate if anybody happened to overturn it, that this did not belong to them, that this had intentionally been placed here. And so it was to literally take this thing, whatever it was of value, to carefully wrap it in a paper thing and place it in the ground. So my hunch is that what we're to hear in the one who had the 1 talent is he is doing something that rabbinic law says is appropriate. Well, the rich man that gave him the 1 to see what he would do with it doesn't think it's appropriate at all. And this servant gets cast out, and what that 1 talent is given to the one with the 5 who made it into 10. So when we think about the time when the master is away, what did the master want? He wanted them to put his wealth at risk to see what they were going to be able to do with it, not to hide it in safety. When the one with 1 looks at the owner and says, I knew you were a hard man, reaping where you do not sow, and so I did this thing. My guess is I did it in the prescribed way, and that's not what the owner wanted. He wanted them to take a risk to multiply the things he had given them. I'm not sure exactly what to do with this story, but where it strikes me is that it does remind me that with all of the particular assets I have been given, I'm not supposed to sit on them and let them atrophy, but I am supposed to take those assets and put them at risk for the glory of the master. As you can see, I'm still working on this one in my mind. I don't recall. I expect I've preached on it before. Where most people preach, and maybe I have too, and that may be why I'm hesitating here a little bit, where most people preach on this one is where Matthew spiritualizes it at the very end. In other words, it's not part of the actual parable, but it seems pretty clear because Matthew does this throughout his parables. He kind of gets preachy, and this is not Jesus, because Jesus doesn't do it in any of the other Gospels, only in Matthew. So we can assume that these are Matthew's words. So he gets to the last here, and we see, for to all those who have, more will be given, and they will have an abundance. But to those who have nothing, even what they have will be taken away. As for this worthless slave, throw him into outer darkness. I heard someone say in one of my Bible studies recently that when he was growing up, Matthew was used on him as a sledgehammer. And that's kind of how this comes down. Maybe how I've preached it before, but I will tell you now, that's not how I would preach it now. We've been given all kinds of assets. And the way we're supposed to utilize those assets is to put them at risk, not to hide them. That's where I will come down the next time I utilize this text. Well, thanks for tuning in. I look to see you in another week.